Is this the deepest wide receiver class that we can remember? That more this week on the couch. Got Chris Trapasso, CBS draft expert and friend of the show here. I noticed you had, I want to say, 20 wide receivers in your top 100. I think something like that.
Yeah,
Is
it's
this the
right in
deepest
that
class
range.
you've ever done? Is this the deepest class you've ever evaluated?
Yes, in terms of pure depth, I think it is. I think there's been other classes that hasn't been or that haven't been quite as deep, but they've had more like well-rounded wide receivers, like a Terry McLaurin in the third round who could do really everything. I think if you need your the fourth round, Malik Washington's there from Virginia, Taj Washington from USC, and Nia Smith, Texas A&M. If you need a burner that's a bigger body, there's Bub Means from your old neck of the woods in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Ryan Flournoy. There's a bunch of niche guys later. I don't love the future X receiver depth, which is, of course, usually pretty difficult to get in any draft beyond the first or second round. But beyond like 2014, 2020, in terms of like day three depth, I think this might be the deepest ever.
Yeah, this is a class. One of the ways I think about it, Chris, is every team should be looking at wide receivers in the first 2 days. I don't care what
Yes,
your depth chart looks like.
for sure.
This is a position where salaries are exploding. I think that just to get out ahead when you do salary caponomics, you just always want to have contributing wide receivers on rookie contracts. When you see that, I mean, compare Saquon Barkley, the top running back, got 13 million a year. Gabriel Davis, who some teams he wouldn't even start for, got 13 million a year. So even just having wide receivers on rookie contracts that can contribute, but like you're saying, role wise, and one of the things that has changed since you and I started doing this a while ago now, is that teams seem to understand that even though there's one WR position, there's really 3, if not more, roles for wide receivers. And DK Metcalf, I think, is a good one that fits in the don't tell me what he can't do, tell me what he can do, and we're going to use him to do that. We're going to get value out of him. So just to compare and contrast, last year we had 3 out of the 4 wide receivers that went in the first round were more specialized receivers. And, I would say, do some data points like Quentin Johnston. Is Quentin Johnston a first rounder in this class?
Probably not. I mean, there's maybe a little hindsight baked into that. But in terms of like, he would fit that role of kind of a niche guy that you knew
Right.
he wasn't going to be a great route runner, but big, fast, or reasonably fast and just stellar after the catch. In this class, you have those premier talents at the top that can really do it all.
Yeah, the top 3. And I think
it's a top 4, honestly, with Brian
well,
Thomas.
okay, because I was going to ask you about Brian Thomas. So the first thing, and it sounds like you already answered this for me, is Brian Thomas the clear wide receiver one in last year's class?
I think so. I mean, because there were question marks, like I mentioned, with the route running polish or lack thereof from Quentin Johnston, the size of Jordan Addison, the injury history of Jackson Smith and Jigba. So I think to just throw those 3 out there, you don't really have any of those, I don't think, with Brian Thomas. He's big, he's fast, after the catch is good, tracking the football deep. It's really all there. And, he did it in the SEC. He even had Malik Nabers next to him and was ultra productive. He could have been that wide receiver to say, hey, look, I had a top 5 pick, almost a once in every 5 to 10 years wide receiver next to me, and I didn't produce, but Brian Thomas still did that.
Yeah. I was looking at, there was a stat out there. I think the good account, I think it was called Football Insights. And they were looking at wide receivers that were first round picks that didn't have, I want to say the number was like over 2.5 yards per route run. And, guys like Jalen Reagor. But in this class, we have maybe a rare alignment of 2 teams that could produce 2 first round picks. And the stat like that dings a wide receiver for not getting a target, for running a route and not getting a target. The idea being, well, if you're an NFL receiver, then in college, you should be the first option. But when you have 2 NFL first round picks in the Texas offense and a terrible passer, because we can get to that, and you have 2 NFL first round picks in LSU, and in some draft classes, tell me if I'm crazy, Chris, in some draft, like 2 years ago, when Kenny Pickett was the top quarterback, and he wasn't even really the top quarterback in hindsight. Malik Nabers maybe could have been the number 1 overall pick. Yeah.
Yeah. No, totally. And I think that's spot on. And we've been talking on here and on Twitter for over a decade now. And it reminds me of, I remember when Robert Woods came out, and it wasn't really yards per route run then, because this kind of predates the PFF era, being the 2013 or 14 draft, or no, I guess 13 draft with Robert Woods. That he had Marquise Lee there the year before. And there was a lot of talk about market share, and was like, hey, I think he's a pretty good prospect. Oh, well, hey, look, he didn't have big market share over his career. And it was like Marquise Lee was in the next year's draft a 2nd-round pick. And at the time, why Robert Woods didn't have that big final season, or as big as people thought, is because there was this up-and-coming younger wide receiver. That's kind of the same feel I get with lower yards per route run numbers for Brian Thomas and for A.D. Mitchell at Texas.
So you mentioned Thomas, and we will see 3 wide receivers, I think, in the top 10. Do lots of betting now. All the draft analyst work that you and your ilk do, like, that's actually, people got money riding on it. Not that people necessarily should. It's still so strange to me that you can bet on something that people can know ahead of time. It's not something that's just decided on. It's strange. But with 3 wide receivers in the top 10, and really, honestly, if we see the wide receivers go 4, 5, 6, that shouldn't surprise anybody. And the only reason they wouldn't go 1, 2, 3 is because of the salary to quarterbacks. I think it's and maybe you can make, I think you can make an argument for Caleb Williams over these 3 wide receivers. But again, any one of these 3 guys, Marvin Harrison, Ohio State, Malik Nabers, LSU, Rome Odunze out of Washington, in most classes, they would be the number 1 wide receiver. So then you move on to Brian Thomas. Should Buffalo fans up in your neck of the woods, should they even entertain the possibility of him falling into a range where Buffalo could trade up for him? Or could we see him go like top 13, 15?
I think the latter is more likely, but I think if he's in the teens, Brandon Beane, his history being really aggressive, wanting to trade up, not being afraid to trade future picks, and the Bills now obviously get that 2025 second rounder in the Stephon Diggs trade, maybe we'll look at it and just say, hey, look, the Bills have ammunition for the future to kind of rebuild in this second stage of Josh Allen's career. Or maybe we're like, duh, that's why Brandon Beane was okay with making an ascension to, say, the Jaguars at pick 17, somewhere in that range. But I can't picture an LSU receiver as productive as Brian Thomas, as big as Brian Thomas, and as fast as him being available much past like the smack dab middle of the first round.
Yeah, someone should trade up for him if he is. I mean, that's the Buffalo Bills, right? I mean, he's everything Gabe Davis, not to dunk on Gabe Davis, but he's everything that the Bills hoped Gabe Davis would become. And he's almost already there. And he's one of those players that his best football is probably ahead of him, to be honest.
For sure.
Just to go back to the top 3, just because it's fun. I mean, do you have any strong takes on any of the 3 of them that would differ from? I mean, we should be gushing about them. As far as how to differentiate, not necessarily how to differentiate between them, but like one that really stands out to you as the one that should be first overall out of the 3, or otherwise something differentiating from, like, hey, probably the 3 best prospects in this class are those 3 wide receivers.
I don't know if I have any widely different opinion on the top 3 quarterbacks. I mean, I have Drake May very close to Caleb Williams, and it kind of feels like, because we've had Caleb Williams like written, and I don't want to say in chalk, but like written in Sharpie going to the Bears for a long time, it kind of feels like if you're just kind of a general draft follower this time of year, you're like, okay, he's definitely by far the best quarterback prospect. I don't think that's true. I think Drake May is nipping on his heels just in terms of the full evaluation. But I do think, because of what you mentioned, the salary difference, and for me, just as like a scout, the positional value, obviously, I think a lot of times I look back at my old grades, and for example, like Tua Tagovailoa had a raw grade for me, like somewhere in the middle of the first round in that draft in 2020, but I have position addition, is just kind of like a funny name that I use.
I like that. Yeah.
In my scouting grade book, where he gets it, all quarterbacks get a huge boost. So it's like almost, if you see a quarterback on my big board that's like in the 20s, his grade's really probably in the 50s. It's just positional value and just the huge disparity in contract value that you get to select that guy. And it's almost worth the roll of the dice. So I think these 3, maybe not all generational guys, and I wouldn't put Caleb Williams on the Andrew Luck, Trevor Lawrence level. I think he's somewhat close. But if those three go 1, 2, 3, if it's Drake May, Jaden Daniels, and Caleb Williams, I'll be completely fine with that.
I want to ask you about Daniels since you brought him up, because I know so much of the draft talk about these prospects. It's so much glass half full, glass half empty. And I put one of my hot takes out there like in the last week because someone, Arno, JJ, was saying, hey, I realized a couple of years ago that a lot of the biggest hits are because of the organization they landed in. And maybe and he didn't say this, but shouldn't necessarily be patting ourselves on the back or taking credit for, oh, I called that, because what really, and I forget who it was who said, I think of the prospect himself as creating the floor, and then the organization really creates the ceiling. And I think that so much of this is, I feel like as draft analysts, and I'm not truly a draft analyst anymore, it's certainly not doing anywhere near the level of work that you're doing. I have Thor Nystrom on next week, what he's doing, Dane Brugler the week after that. Get your beast out there. At first, it's worth subscribing to The Athletic just to get the beast and all the great work you're doing at CBS. But it just educate me about the prospects, make me understand the nature of the prospect, and then I have context for watching their career. And Jaden Daniels, all these quarterback prospects have really been dissected. And I feel like there's this glass half full, glass half empty thing with Daniels, where some will say, well, look, only when he had 2 first-round wide receivers, only when he was at LSU did all of a sudden he get into the conversation as this high of a pick, and that, oh, danger. But then on the other side, I see an even more balanced take of, no, he actually developed. He actually improved. You can watch him grow. Should we? Which side of that argument do you fall on in terms of more caution, or saying, no, that's real development and we have to give him credit for it?
No, I think he definitely matured from his time at Arizona State, and to kind of go back to early on in his college career, I like that he started early and he showed flashes early. It was not just someone that either just didn't play or played badly, and it's somewhat of the reason why I'm a little bit lower on Bo Nix, because the difference in Bo Nix, you can say that it was development, but I think the system there, and that's a whole, different conversation, but you saw it with Jaden Daniels that, hey, with time and better system, better blocking, better receivers, he could be really, really good from early on in his Arizona State days. And then to the argument that, hey, he was throwing to 2, maybe top 12 wide receivers. Well, he put up monster stats. He did about as well as you can do with those wide receivers. The one concern, or I guess a few minor concerns that I have with him, I'm sure you've seen it. I'm sure a lot of your viewers have seen it. And the pressure to sack rate being relatively high for him, for being a quarterback that is predicated on his dynamic athleticism, scoring 50-yard touchdowns. And he can do that. But I do think at times he takes more hits and more sacks than you would expect for someone that is supposed to kind of lean on his legs. And what I always use, Josh Allen is kind of his own beast in terms of what he can do athletically. The fact that Patrick Mahomes is a good athlete, but I don't think if you're off the top of your head thinking of the greatest athletes at the quarterback spot today, you don't start with Patrick Mahomes. But Mahomes is always near the bottom of the league in pressure to sack rate. It's just so hard to get him to the turf. Spatial awareness, we hear that phrase a lot. We heard it during the playoffs. I don't know if Jaden Daniels quite has that. And that, kind of concerns me a little bit, because whether he goes to the Washington Commanders or another team, the Patriots, or maybe there's a surprise and he drops a little bit, he's going to deal with more pressure than he dealt with at LSU. And that's kind of been a little thing that I look for. It kind of sounds counterintuitive. I like quarterback prospects that have dealt with crap in college, that have dealt with adversity, that have a bad offensive line. The scheme isn't very good. It seems as though the quarterbacks that not even just have a lot of talent around them, but don't deal with a lot of pressure, or the conference that they're in doesn't play defense, things like that, usually they have a harder time. I think Zach Wilson is the prime example here, that I was one of them that fell in love with him and was like, man, look at that throw off play action, that bootleg. At BYU, he was pressured like 20% of the time in his final season. Got to the Jets, and that went up almost double to around 40%, if not higher. And he just couldn't process quick enough. He wasn't used to that. So Jaden Daniels, the fact that he doesn't have immense spatial awareness, takes a lot of hits and sacks, and that he just wasn't pressured very often. A lot of those pressures were due to him just running. Those are my two concerns. But the development as a pocket passer, I think, was very clear to see from before he transferred to LSU 2022 with the Tigers, and then this past season.
Yeah, I think that pressure to sack ratio stat, I want to say maybe it's a Zach Kruger it's putting out there. My brain,
Yep.
at 48.
NBC.
It's leaky, but I do really like that stat. And of course, when he was showing us on Twitter the bust rate in terms of the players that were worst at that, I think you're right that what's nice about that is it's a rate. So it's controlled for, hey, if you have a really good offensive line and you have an offense where things come easy to you, there's still some sample of snaps we can look at. And if when you are presented with pressure, you have trouble eluding the pressure or don't get the ball out quickly enough, or even I remember watching Josh Allen at Wyoming and noting, wow, Josh Allen is big and strong enough that when he's in the grasp of a defender, he can just throw the ball away. That's important. That translates to the NFL. That's saved yards. And if you, that helps you lower that pressure to sack ratio. So even if Jaden Daniels is being lifted up by his level of surrounding talent, if he's only seeing pressure 2 or 3 times a game, and one of those 3 times he's getting sacked, where other quarterbacks are seeing it 10 times a game and only getting sacked twice or once even, that, because like you say, in video games, right, we put everything in terms of popular culture and things that we all understand, you're turning up the difficulty on the video game. And unlike video games, you're also turning up the difficulty on the emotional, psychological, spiritual things you're dealing with, because so much is focused on you. That's why Caleb Williams, and I think in hindsight, Chris, I think we may see, if we see a best case scenario Drake May, or a best case scenario Jaden Daniels, especially for fantasy football. Of course, we'll switch back to fantasy football mode after the draft. We may say, well, those guys were very close to Caleb Williams' prospects. What Caleb Williams has going for him that I think no number 1 selected quarterback ever has before that I can remember is he's not going to a team that's selecting number 1 because they were so terrible the previous year. He's going to a team that has Matt Williamson put it well on a show a couple weeks ago. He said they've built a nest for him. They've built a nest. So he has DJ Moore, he has Keenan Allen, he has a developing running game. He has, finally they're getting the offensive line, where New England and Washington are picking 2nd and 3rd because they're terrible. They're teams that have a lot to work on. And then again, you're saying, well, how are they going to perform whenever they have to deal with all the adversity that comes with helping rescue a team instead of landing on a team that's already rescued, and now you're going to take them to the next level? Okay, going back to Buffalo really quick. And this is we can tie in. This can tie into the Texas receivers. So first, let me ask you about the Texas receivers. There's so much nuance. Because receivers are the headline here. I really want to dig into this receiver class before we turn the page to a few other things. Watching A.D. Mitchell, watching Xavier Worthy, how much did it factor into your evaluation how poor the quarterback play was? I'm thinking Zach Mettenberger back at LSU with. Speaking of LSU receivers like Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry, you watch them, like, those guys can play. He can't, but they can. How does that give context to your evaluations of those guys?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what's funny, just a quick anecdote that I remember when Quinn Ewers was early January was deciding whether or not he should go to the draft. And I always like to watch quarterbacks first, so my opinions don't change with pro days or anything like that. And I watched Ewers before he decided whether he was going to come back to Texas or go into this draft. And I was like, this guy needs to go back. Like, he is not, I mean, for being such a big recruit, for being such, like, the highest rated recruit ever, and was at Ohio State, transferred, I was like, he definitely needs another year. In terms of how it factored in, I think there were some missed throws, but when you're watching, and fortunately I can get a fair amount, or all of the LS or the all 22 for Texas, you can see if a wide receiver was open. I think giving receivers more chances to make a play on the football maybe would show more of, does Xavier Worthy play bigger than his size? Does A.D. Mitchell play up to his size? But with wide receivers, it's definitely, it's kind of like the opposite of Zach Wilson, where you can be lulled to sleep with just how easy everything was in that BYU offense. At Texas, like you're saying, there's, that was a great route. But the throw wasn't there. So it's, you have to really make a concerted effort to say that was a win for a rep for Xavier Worthy, say, or for A.D. Mitchell, even if maybe the ball wasn't even thrown in his direction.
So how do you come out on these guys? Because these are two, and we're going to talk about a few of the more polarizing prospects. And what's neat is in this class, that's the thing. Again, in last year's class, if a Mitchell or a Worthy or in those class, teams might have to be forced to make the call on them around the 15th pick. This
Yeah.
year, it's more like late first round. Because you're looking at production. I know a lot of people like in their models how much they weight production, and again, that's where Quinn Ewers comes in a little bit. I think with Mitchell, you're looking at consistency. I think with Worthy, you have the ghost of the fastest guy in the class. Like, how often does the fastest wide receiver in the class really work out? How do you resolve these things when it comes down to, and I think this is where Buffalo comes in. If Buffalo doesn't trade up to get a Thomas, should Buffalo fans be happy if they take a Texas wide receiver?
I think so. Xavier Worthy to Curtis Samuel seems redundant, but I don't think that means that the Bills can't add 2 really fast, smaller wide receivers. I mean, they had Stephon Diggs, John Brown, and Cole Beasley in 2020, and that was the most productive Bills offense. That was the best team that I've watched since I was about 5 years old. So, and they weren't towering really at any spot. They had Gabe Davis as the receiver 4, but they were really based on just being small and being able to separate. I have Worthy graded ahead of AD Mitchell because of what I kind of alluded to in my last answer, that I think even as spindly as he is, like 6 foot under or right around 180 pounds, 170 something pounds, I think he plays a little bigger. There's in that Alabama game, there's a few catches that he made where he bounced off tacklers. I think he likes to play bigger. He's not afraid of contact. Now, is he Deebo Samuel? Of course, no, he's not. But I think someone that has 4.21 speed, that's a trait, of course, and that will be something that even before he runs his first route, the safeties on the other team will say, oh, there's Worthy. We need to make sure we know where he is on every play. And he can catch an RPO slant and maybe glance off a linebacker that doesn't kind of square him up perfectly and create some extra yardage. The reason I'm a little lower on AD Mitchell is kind of the same reason, that at 6'2", 210 with low 4.3 speed, like you mentioned, not ultra consistent. And it's kind of kept asking myself while I was watching him, why wasn't he more productive? Like Brian Thomas scored 17 touchdowns. Now, yes, the quarterback play was different. And at Georgia, AD Mitchell did make some plays in the college football playoff, but he feels like someone physically should be dominant, and he wasn't really in college. Now, the smoothness after the catch is certainly there, or running routes is certainly there, and I'm just a little concerned about him after the catch because of those same things that I mentioned, that at 6'2", with that speed and over 200 pounds, he should be like a runaway train every time he catches the football, and he's not really. But because he's so big, because of of his fluidity as a route runner, he still has a high second round grade for me. And I think the Bills at 28 with either one of those 2 receivers would add kind of that explosive element to their offense that they're looking for.
Are there any other receivers that the Bills should be? We've named 6 now. The 2 LSU. Are there any other receivers that the Bills should be considering with their late first round pick? Or if none of those 6 fall, they should just kick it down the road to the next day?
Ladd McConkey, I think, has to be in consideration. The only dings that I see from him, and it's probably easier to just talk about his few dings and rattle off all of his strengths. He has very short arms and small hands. And then in his final season at Georgia, only had 30 catches, but did battle injury. That was not like he was on the field 80 or 90% of the snaps and just didn't produce. But beyond that, the route running is awesome. Nuance, we talked about that a lot, that he's not just the fastest guy in and out of his breaks, but will sell the post before going to the corner with a shoulder fake, head fake, stutter steps, changing speeds. I think he's really well ahead of most other receivers in this class running routes. And after the catch, he's good. He is someone that will bounce off tacklers. He has great vision. He wants to create after the catch, and he did that in the SEC. And I don't think that's an easy task for any wide receiver. So he's like my favorite Bills stay put at 28 type player. I don't think Xavier Worthy is going to be there. And again, consistency issues kind of worry me with AD Mitchell. Consistency was a problem. And again, not to dunk on him, but that was a problem for Gabe Davis. So Ladd McConkey would be the other receiver that the Bills, I think, should consider late in the first round.
Yeah, he seems like, especially if he's in an offense that utilizes the players in their offense to their fullest, he could be a big hit, a really big hit. There's a lot of wide receivers after that have ifs, or maybe another way we could put it is they may have a bigger, kind of like Mitchell, they have a more of a gap between their floor and their ceiling.
For sure.
Classic second round receivers, really. And this is a good draft to be looking at them. So, there's a lot of these guys where, again, glass half full, glass half empty. A guy like Keon Coleman. You mentioned Deebo Samuel's, Malachi Corley, the next Deebo Samuel. Are we trying too hard? Xavier Leggett is another one where, depending on how you look at his production and how he produced, how it translates, you might be very bullish or bearish on him. Jermaine Burton is a really interesting one. I know that Dane Brugler put out there, hey, it's 6 schools in 8 years. And yes, that includes high school, but that still is something to consider. And he said one NFL scout said at Georgia and Alabama, he was on the coach's sorry Joe list. When you look at this group, this next group, the group that we're probably going to reset and think about when we get some sleep after the first round and let it all sink in, is there one that stands out to you as one that you would stand on the table for and say, I'm in on the upside of this guy? Or alternatively, when you'd say like, nah, I see why people have hesitation. I have hesitation too.
And this is a good group to talk about because we've seen even the recent history of how good you can get at wide receiver on the second and the third round of the draft on day 2, that there's the league is littered with stars at the receiver spot that went the second or third round. To kind of run through them, I love Jermaine Burton on film. I know there's off-field concerns. A few people that I've talked to within the league say he's kind of a head case. That was just the actual phrase that was used in a text that I got a few weeks ago. But on the field, running those intricate vertical routes at Alabama that we saw from John Mechie and Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith and Henry Ruggs, like he runs them as sharply as those guys did. He has a lot of juice. He catches everything. Not a big yards after the catch guy, but again, like I was saying at the outset of this interview, not maybe going to ever be 130 target, 1,500 yard receiver. I mean, those are hard to come by. But if you want nuance, getting vertical, and then the ball tracking ability, you're thinking, all right, Marvin Harrison Jr. is great at that. Malik Nabers is really good in that area. Jermaine Burton, I think, in terms of tracking and vertical ability, is up there. He is a big-time prospect, was productive at Georgia and at Alabama. The guy actually that I would stand on the table for, and all these like appearances I've been doing, I've been saying the same name. You actually didn't mention him. Javon Baker from UCF. Ooh. He is someone started at Alabama, and he was one of the first receivers outside of like the perceived first rounders that I watched in January. And I remember, I don't know what I was even referencing, if it was a Matrix reference, but I like whispered out to myself and said, he's the one. Like he is that second round guy that beats press with physicality, with wiggle, shows some Ladd McConkey-esque nuance or intricacy running routes. The top of his route stem will fake to the outside before hitting the dig route. Fourth best contested catch win rate in the league or in the draft class. I think that certainly matters, that you want him to be able to get open, but you want him to win in traffic. Now we ran 4.54. So some teams will think, hey, it's too slow, or maybe he's going to go later in the second or even into the third. But we all know that speed in terms of what is measured at the combine at receiver is not quite as important as it might be glamorized during the combine and during pro days. And I think he's really good after the catch too. He's 6'1", almost 210. He's one of the biggest receivers in the class and what is kind of becoming an increasingly lighter position in the NFL. So Javon Baker from UCF, former Alabama guy who went to UCF and averaged like 20 yards per catch in his 2 seasons. He would be that day 2 guy that I think we're going to look back on and be like, that's the new, AJ Brown, DK Metcalf, George Pickens type that went on day 2, was like the 7th or 8th receiver picked, but is one of the best ones from the class.
Yeah, and this is the class where there's going to be at least 1 or 2 of those guys. Okay, to wind up the wide receiver talk, because of how good this class is at the top, again, about 20 in the top 100. Top 100 is about the first, that's the first 3 rounds of the draft. And 20, I don't know numbers off the top of my head, but I have to think we've never seen 20 wide receivers go in the first 2 days of the draft. Maybe we have. But what about third day guys who maybe wouldn't be third day guys in such a great class? Who's your favorite sleeper in this class?
There's 2 guys, and I'll list 2 because I kind of mentioned earlier that there's so many niche players later that I really like. Malik Washington from Virginia, 42-inch vertical. He's built like a fire hydrant, started at Northwestern, and was just a high volume, like the whole offense at Virginia ran through him. And it was bubble screen, RPO, everything underneath. And he was like a mini Deebo Samuel, breaking tackles, making guys miss. I actually tweeted it like early in the draft process, and I saw that Malik Washington retweeted it recently, where he literally throws a defensive back. Like he runs into a safety, gets low, and just tosses him aside. So if you want that, hey, it's 3rd and 6, but our quarterback's a little timid, he's going to throw it 3 yards short of the sticks, let's get that first down. That's Malik Washington from Virginia. He ran like 4.5, so some teams might say he's kind of slow, but you don't need to be crazy fast if you're that underneath kind of chain moving slot guy. And then I'll go way deep, small school, Ryan Flournoy from Southeast Missouri State. If you look at his athleticism profile, 6 foot, 200 pounds, ran 4.44, 39-inch vertical, 11-foot broad jump. So he is like crazy explosive for his size, especially, again, he's a little bigger. I mean, 5 to 10 years ago, he wouldn't be considered that, but I think in this draft, he's a bigger wide receiver and was crazy productive. After the catch, you see him on film and it's all right. He catches this comeback and then he falls to the turf or runs out of bounds. And then there's his next 3 catches. He is just running roughshod through everybody and is like a moose in the open field. So yes, he was doing that at a smaller school level, but for a team that, again, maybe wants a little size and says, look, we know you're not going to get open every route, but we want you to get down the field or maybe to catch a comeback and then make that corner miss. Ryan Flournoy, day 3 guy from Southeast Missouri State, I think could be a steal 5th or 6th round.
Yeah, and I think in his a couple of games against Power 5 teams, he looked like he fit in. So that's what we want
for sure. He did.
Guys. We want them to dominate against that lower level of competition, and then when they do give us some tape against the higher level of competition, look like they fit in. Okay, broad question here, because it sounds like we know some of the players that you are higher on than the consensus. Who's somebody you're lower on? And not just, we're not talking wide receivers, just the whole draft. Who's somebody that you see, hey, the consensus is saying this guy should go this high, and you watch him and you're like, yeah, I don't see it. I'm not trucking with this. The team that takes him where the draft media says he should go is making a mistake.
Man, there's a bunch. Xavier Legette, who you mentioned earlier, I'm not quite as high on. He's fast and big. He's kind of has that Deebo Samuel build at Deebo Samuel's school. I didn't see the tackle breaking ability. I mean, there was a few long runs where he would catch a slant and just turn on those 4.39 jets. And I mean, that's technically yards after the catch, but Deebo was so good at just manufacturing yards after the catch that weren't there. And it feels like if the Bills pick Xavier Legette at 28, no one would really bat an eye. I think that's way too early for him. I think he's more of a 2nd or a 3rd round pick. And this one is going to seem crazy, but I felt a little validated at the combine talking with Greg Cosell. I was so fortunate to be able to sit down just in the media room, talk to him. Joe Alt from Notre Dame. And he was actually interviewing with someone else, I think Paul Kaharski, who has his own like Titans website now, and was like, I didn't really love his film. And after that, I kind of went up to him and said, hey, I don't really love Joe Alt's film either. Now, athletically, lengthwise, if you're looking at the analytics profile, not a lot of pressures allowed. He definitely feels like someone who would be worth maybe the number 5 overall pick to the Chargers. He just felt a little sloppy on film for me, that I didn't see a lot of as many clean wins as I expected. Now, maybe that's just because he has to get stronger. And there are some case studies like Brian O'Neill comes to mind instantly, that when he came out of Pitt, I was like, this guy's not anywhere close to being strong enough. He got stronger and is one of the best right tackles in the league. Or is he like a Garrett Bradbury on that same line, who had all the athleticism in the world, but just was never quite big enough and strong enough to deal with those super powerful rushers on the inside in the NFL. So Joe Alt, I don't hate him. I just feel like he's more of a mid to late round first round pick, as opposed to someone who's going to go inside the top 5.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. You mentioned Brian O'Neill. What was he, like a 3rd round pick, I think?
Yeah, 2nd or 3rd. Yeah, 2018.
So the 2nd day pick, Joe Alt, and it's telling that in your story, Greg Cosell, who's outstanding, had him on the show. It was one of the few guests that I was genuinely nervous. I was genuinely feeling like, wow, do I even belong in a football conversation?
That's how I felt too.
Yeah, well, because he was, especially in the football media, he was a trailblazer. He was right there whenever the first idea that, hey, maybe people like technical talk, maybe intellectual talk, and going in depth about the NFL. They didn't think back in the 80s that any football fans cared about that. And Greg Cosell said, I know, I think so. I think we can talk about football in a more intelligent way, and in a lot of ways paved the road for all of us, the whole football media, do-it-yourself football media that we have now that we've come up through because of Greg Cosell. But I think it's fitting in your story. He was talking to a Tennessee Titans guy, Paul Kaharski's been doing it forever, and it's great because that's obviously a name. If he doesn't go to the Chargers at number 5, I think that we'll be sitting up straight. And number 7, staying with the offensive tackles, and this is a draft class. That's why you like what the Bills did in some ways, trading Stephon Diggs, because this is the class to be replacing. Just like I couldn't have turned out better for Minnesota that they took Justin Jefferson to replace him. But the Bills could pull off maybe not quite as amazing of a transition, but a similar transition, and one where they don't lose a lot in terms of a Super Bowl window. If it's not wide receiver you're looking for in this class, then it is offensive tackle. This is a great class to get your offensive really tackle. Good. And it's another premium position, another one that's going to get that position addition that you talk about. Now, I've got my Steelers shirt on here. It's great. This has been like the best couple of weeks to be a Pittsburgh sports fan in 5 years. So I'm basking in my Steelers happiness right now. And if there is a name I'm focusing in, a couple of times it's happened. A couple of times it's actually happened, Chris, where going into the draft, I have a name, and when they walk up to the podium, I'm visualizing it, and I actually hear the name. I think the last time it happened was Cameron Hayward, and that turned out all right.
Okay.
The name this year for me is Amarius Mims. But this is a different kind of evaluation because we've got 8 starts. I think you also have a guy who, when the dust settles, could be the best offensive tackle in this class. Maybe it's just the symmetry of having the 2 Georgia guys. How do you handle an evaluation like Mims, especially in such a very good class of offensive tackles?
Well, I'll say this, that yes, you're right. The smaller sample size, the injuries certainly factor in with NFL teams. But me not having any medical background or even having access to any of those medicals, almost all my evaluations, unless there's a gigantic red flag injury-wise that's just sticking out like a sore thumb or super off-field or legal problems, all my evaluations are just like what I've seen on the field. So like if he's healthy, which is usually the case, like what you want your players to be, if he's healthy, here's what I think he can do, what he can't do. And with Amarius Mims, for him to jump, I believe 9.5 or 9.6 in the broad jump at 6'8", 340 was like something that was way not talked about enough after the combine. It was way undersold how impressive that is. And actually early on in the process, and it kind of got a little too tedious, so I stopped doing it. I'm watching the film of Amarius Mims. I recorded a video and talked over it and put it on TikTok, put it on Instagram and Twitter of a climb to the second level where he's losing his balance and is able to like regain his balance by just putting his arm on the defender and regaining his balance. All of that mass, it's almost 6'8", 340, 99 times out of 100 or 99 prospects out of 100 that have that happen. They're on the ground. The linebacker makes the play on the running back. But that individual play, and I don't like to be someone that's going to, grade Odell Beckham Jr. based on just the catch alone, things like that, Jadeveon Clowney with the hit. But that reminded me of, man, this guy is a plus athlete. He has awesome balance, and I think balance is very undersold at the offensive tackle position. Jonah Jackson is one who I remember watching at Ohio State being like, man, he's not really that big or strong, but he's never on the ground. And I get that feeling with Amarius Mims. And Jonah Jackson, was a Pro Bowler on that rookie contract with the Lions. But with that balance, I think Amarius Mims, immense length, he's powerful, very calm, cool, and collected in pass protection. Now, it could be similar to Broderick Jones that he doesn't hit the ground running week 1. But if you put those 2 on the book end of the offensive line, maybe by November, December, and then 2025, you're talking of like, man, you have 2 of the best young tackles in football that no one wants to deal with because they're big, they're athletic, and they're super strong.
Yeah, that's what I like. And the Steelers don't usually have offensive tackles like that. But going back to something you mentioned, back there was probably a good, 3, 4, 5 years. At the end there, I was working for Bleacher Report, doing a ton of draft writing for them, where I really was neck deep in draft, all the positions, all the prospects. I remember it is because it just sets the stage for the NFL career, and so much more of how the NFL career goes makes sense, and so much more of fit and projecting a player, because that's again, going back to that point, and I'm going to bring that in one of my last football questions before we go off the rails for a couple of minutes. For offensive tackles, offensive linemen in general, but especially offensive tackles, because they're kind of out on an island, recover. It's just like we're talking about quarterbacks. So I want to see how you're doing when things are difficult for you. I don't care about how you do when things are easy. Where offensive tackles, recovery is so important.
Huge.
Recovery, and because they're so good, because if we're talking about NFL prospect, they're going to be good. Again, just give me the 10% of snaps where they're beaten initially. I want to see how they react to that, because they're going to be beaten initially a lot more in the NFL. So when you mention Mims' athletic recovery, that's so important. And he's. I hope so. I hope that we'll, the Steelers fans, we can all celebrate around that, and it can unlock an actual functional offense. And again, fit comes in here too. And I want to add, and this is why I want to give you a third choice, because one of the last thing I'll ask you here is, we have the top 3 quarterbacks. We have JJ McCarthy, and JJ McCarthy, probably his floor in the draft is 11 or 12. Maybe he won't be a trade up. Maybe that's all Jim Harbaugh trying to get someone to trade up for him. But he's probably not going to fall past 11 or 12. But then you have Bo Nix, who you already mentioned, and Michael Penix. And there's some debate. There's some smoke. It's April. It's a lying season. They're going to go in the first round. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe they will. If we hear either of their names called in the first round, will you say that's a mistake? Will you say, actually, that's a pretty savvy move? Or will it depend on where they land?
Good question. I think really anything with Bo Nix, I will just have to put my stamp on it and just say I would think it would be a mistake regardless of team. I mean, you could maybe quasi talk me into his fit with Sean Payton, who kind of wants that underneath, get it out quickly, point guard style. And that's really what he did at Oregon.
Yeah.
But that's what I love about the draft. And my job is that I give these evaluations. I have my scouting grade book that I've kind of input this formula, spits out a grade. So there's no hindsight with me. Like I'll say, look, I'm not a big Bo Nix guy. I think he should be like late first, early second round. And that's with the position addition. But I'll split the answer in half. If Michael Penix lands with the Minnesota Vikings, I think that's like the best landing spot of any of the quarterbacks, even better than the Chicago Bears, obviously, with Justin Jefferson and Hawkinson. We talked about Brian O'Neill. He is coming back from an injury, but is really good. Christian Darrisaw is awesome at left tackle. Kevin O'Connell, Josh McCown there. They have just an infrastructure that I think breeds quarterback success. And we'll see that it wasn't just Kirk Cousins the last couple of years there in Minnesota. So Michael Penix, if he lands with Minnesota, any of the other teams, I think I would be a little concerned about. But Bo Nix, to me, I think is more of a, Derek Carr type guy where you would pick in the second round and feel a lot better about the value that you would get there as opposed to picking him in the first.
Yeah, the Broncos don't trade up for McCarthy, and they're on the clock at 12. There'll probably be a lot of Broncos fans. So this is how it is to be a Steelers fan lately. It's just anyone but this name, not this name, not Kenny Pickett, not Najee Harris. We already knew this was Najee Harris. So it's not picturing a positive thing. It's trying to evict the negative visualization. Yep. And I think for Denver fans, hey, Bo Nix in the second, okay, he's a nice moldable lump of clay, and he's already shown that he can do that. But that's not a first round pick. Michael Penix is a little more debatable because the thing you like about Michael Penix is so many reps. And arm talent and the ability to I mean, there's just some things, and like you said, if he's falls into an established offense like Minnesota, he can unlock what's already there. If he has to help rebuild an offense like a New England or Las Vegas, it might not go well. Okay, going off the rails for the last 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes here. I got to ask, just because it's on everyone's minds. You're up there. You're still in upstate New York. You're still in Western New York, right? I mean, that was in the path of totality.
Yes.
The eclipse. How was the eclipse for you this week down in New Orleans? We had 86% coverage, but we had 100% cloud coverage.
It was so awesome, even though we did have cloud cover in the town that I'm in. But what was kind of the silver lining is we saw a glimpse about 20 minutes before where you could see that it was starting, like the sun kind of peeked through. But because there was full cloud cover, it got midnight dark for 1.5 minutes. And it happened. I mean, of course, it was super dark. There was clouds and there was no sun in the way, but how fast it got dark was incredible. It was it's starting to get a little darker. This is cool. And then 45 seconds later, literally the street lights came on. I was recording a video. I switched it to the front facing camera. Couldn't see my own face. Like it was so cool. My 2 daughters that are 6 and 5 absolutely loved it. Yeah, they loved it. We were there with my extended family. It was just a really cool experience. Didn't get to, again, see the actual eclipse picture that a lot of people were posting, as it was 100% right in the path of totality. But how dark it got so fast was really cool.
Yeah, it's great that your kids were old enough that y'all remember it together. I mean, that's one of the things, the eclipse, the specifics of the eclipse, your beliefs, there's a lot of interesting beliefs, a lot of stuff you could study about eclipses in different cultures over the years and what they've believed about it. But just having this shared experience that you can all come back to. Remember when that happened? That was pretty cool. And certainly, I think that is that great value. And then like what the birds stop tweeting, like the birds stop chirping, like it's just an eeriness about it that kind of pulls you into the moment and the presence of the moment, something that's so hard sometimes in our lives. And then I also learned, because we've got box turtles, and my wife, the love of my life, Kate, and I were going out and checking, even though it's only 86% here, because what I learned looking up is actually it was the Galapagos turtles, the great Galapagos turtles. But I guess the last time that they were observing animals during a complete eclipse, they actually had some activities with each other. They were enjoying an intimate moment. They said this only animal that they could observe. So the eclipse can mean a lot of things to a lot of different animals, but certainly I think for a lot of Americans, it was a very memorable time. I guess, the last thing I'll ask you, I should set it up like this. Are you a hockey fan at all?
Yes, I've watched the Buffalo Sabres since I can remember.
How do you fix the Sabres?
I don't know. It's like my dad and I just stopped talking about them the last couple of weeks, which is not like us. I mean, even throughout this NHL record long drought, we talk about the Sabres. I mean, not as much as we talk about the Bills, but we definitely it is a topic of conversation when we go out for breakfast and things like that. I think they just need to be more aggressive in free agency, that they've kind of been leaning on their younger players for so long that have shown glimpses, but then they face a more experienced, more physical team, and they usually get kind of outclassed. So I think being more aggressive in free agency to bring in established, older players with this group of young guns that they have, I think would maybe be the best course of action.
Yeah, no shortage of young talent, but that's rough. I am just as a lifelong Penguins fan, I'm just liking that they're alive somehow. They're just like that. That's like the Undertaker coming out of the coffin, like they're not dead yet, but we'll see if there's more disappointment or if there's maybe a little bit of excitement. Always excitement, no disappointment with everything that Chris does over at CBS. The draft, it's almost here. The talk will be over. We got to do something in the meantime, so we'll talk about it. But really, we can't wait for the draft to get here because of people like Chris. And again, coming up, Thor Nystrom next week on the couch. Dane Brugler, week of the draft, and of course during the draft, we'll be here live with Matt Waldman, with Jason Wood, and a cavalcade of guests on draft night. So join us, everybody. Y'all are the best. You make this worth it so much because you are so very classy.